Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest chapters. Tonight, we're unpacking one of medieval Europe's most catastrophic exercises in religious enthusiasm and adult negligence, the Children's Crusade of 1225. Before we get into this absolutely wild story of how thousands of kids convinced themselves they could walk to Jerusalem and convert Muslims through the power of pure hearts and terrible planning, go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready for some medieval chaos served with a side of biting commentary. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing this community span the globe, while we collectively shake our heads at historical disasters that were entirely, painfully preventable. Now settle in, maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to explore how two shepherd boys managed to convince entire communities that sending children on a 1,000-mile death march was somehow God's plan. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder how humanity has survived this long, and yet here we are. So dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into this medieval masterclass in how religious fervor, geographic ignorance, and adult irresponsibility can combine to create absolute tragedy. Picture this. The year is 1212, and Europe has collectively lost its mind. Not in the usual way, like starting a war over who owns a particularly nice hill, but in a special, uniquely medieval way that involves sending thousands of children on a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem. Because nothing says divine intervention like a 12-year-old with a walking stick and unwavering faith in miracles. It started, as these things often do, with a shepherd boy. Not just any shepherd boy, mind you, but Stephen of Cloyes, a French kid who claimed Jesus Christ himself had appeared to him in the fields. Now, when a modern child says they've seen Jesus, we schedule a therapy appointment. In 1212, we scheduled a crusade. Stephen announced that Christ had handed him a letter, personally addressed, requesting that he lead the children of France to Jerusalem. The sea would part for them, just like it did for Moses, except with more begates and significantly less divine intervention. Did anyone ask to see this letter? Of course not. Did anyone question why the Son of God would choose a random shepherd boy as his personal postal service? Absolutely not. This was an age where people believed that if you didn't go to church, your teeth would fall out, so a talking Jesus in a field was just Tuesday. Stephen began preaching in the markets, and children flocked to him like moths to a flame. Except the flame was religious fervor, and the moths were prepubescent Europeans with questionable decision-making skills. He promised them adventure, salvation, and the chance to free the Holy Land through the power of pure hearts and divine favor. What he didn't mention was that the average life expectancy of a crusader was roughly equivalent to a Mayfly with commitment issues. The adults, bless their medieval hearts, thought this was a splendid idea. Not splendid enough to go themselves, mind you, but certainly splendid enough to send their children. After all, children were pure of heart, untainted by sin, and therefore more likely to succeed where grown men with actual weapons and military training had failed repeatedly. This logic was about as sound as using a chocolate teapot in a bonfire, but logic was apparently optional in the 13th century. Meanwhile, across the Rhine, because one child-led crusade wasn't enough, a German boy named Nicholas was having his own divine encounter. Nicholas claimed that Jesus had appeared to him too, because apparently the Son of God was making house calls that year, like a particularly ambitious insurance salesman. Nicholas's version of the plan was slightly different. The children would march to Italy, board ships, cross the Mediterranean, and convert all the Muslims through the sheer power of youthful enthusiasm. The fact that most of these children spoke only their local dialect and wouldn't be able to order bread in Jerusalem, let alone conduct theological debates, seemed to escape everyone's attention. Nicholas was older than Stephen, perhaps 14 or 15, which in medieval terms made him practically a geriatric statesman. He had charisma, conviction, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been wrong about anything important in your entire short life. Adults listened to him with the kind of respect usually reserved for bishops or people who owned more than one cow. The recruitment process for the Children's Crusade was refreshingly simple compared to the Roman legions. No physical examinations, no weapons training, no checking if you could carry a mule uphill. The only requirements were being under 18 and possessing an unshakable belief that God would personally intervene to ensure your success. Experience with long-distance walking was helpful, but not mandatory. Knowledge of geography was irrelevant, since divine providence would handle navigation. The ability to survive on roots and prayers was assumed. Children left their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a wooden cross, and dreams of glory. Parents waved goodbye from doorsteps, some weeping, others genuinely believing they were sending their offspring on the adventure of a lifetime. A few wise mothers tried to pack extra bread, but their children refused it. They were going to be fed by miracles, sustained by faith, and guided by angels. Practical provisions were for people who lacked confidence in divine intervention. The German contingent, led by Nicholas, set off from Cologne like a parade of religious fervor and poor planning. Picture 20,000 children, ranging in age from 7 to 17, marching through the countryside with the organizational structure of a gaggle of geese and roughly the same survival instincts. They sang hymns, carried banners, and walked with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested they knew exactly where they were going, even though most of them had never been more than 5 miles from home. The local villagers watched these processions with expressions ranging from awe to horror. Some threw flowers, others offered food, and a few practical souls tried to convince the children to go home. But you can't reason with religious enthusiasm any more than you can teach a fish to knit. The children pressed on, certain that every step brought them closer to glory and divine favor. The weather, unfortunately, had not received the memo about divine intervention. Rain fell on the just and unjust alike, which included several thousand drenched children who had expected God to provide personal umbrellas. Mud sucked at their shoes when they still had shoes. Blisters formed, burst, and formed again. But these were minor inconveniences compared to the great work they were doing. Surely God would not let them suffer for long. Food became an issue roughly 36 hours into the journey. Turns out that feeding 20,000 people requires more than good intentions and scattered charity from sympathetic villagers. The children had expected manna from heaven, or at least some divine multiplication of loaves and fishes. What they got instead was hunger. That gnawing, persistent hunger that turns noble quests into desperate scrambles for sustenance. Some children begged in the villages they passed through. Others foraged for berries and roots, which led to the first casualties when several kids learned the hard way that not all mushrooms are edible. A few entrepreneurial youngsters tried to work for food, but there's limited demand for unskilled child labor, even in the 13th century, and even less when that labor comes with religious proclamations and an unwavering belief that they're destined for greater things. The first deaths weren't dramatic. No battles, no martyrdom, just children who sat down to rest and never got up again. Exhaustion, hunger, exposure, illness, the whole catalogue of misery that befalls anyone foolish enough to attempt a 1,000-mile walk without proper preparation. The other children prayed over the bodies, said their farewells, and continued marching. After all, those who had died were surely in heaven now, and their sacrifice would be remembered when Jerusalem was liberated. Nicholas, to his credit, maintained his optimism with the tenacity of someone who had never been catastrophically wrong before. When children collapsed, he declared it a test of faith. When food ran out, he promised that God would provide. When they reached the Alps, those towering monuments to geographical inconvenience, he announced that they would cross them through divine assistance, possibly involving some kind of mountain-moving miracle. The Alps, however, were distinctly unimpressed by religious fervor. Mountains have a way of remaining mountainous regardless of how many prayers you throw at them. The passes were treacherous, the weather was hostile, and the altitude was utterly indifferent to the spiritual purity of 13-year-old crusaders. Children who had never seen snow found themselves struggling through drifts taller than they were. Those who had never climbed anything steeper than a church steps discovered that mountains require actual physical effort, not just faith. More children died in the Alps, some from exposure, others from falls, a few from simple exhaustion. The survivors pressed on, because turning back seemed like an admission of failure, and failure was not part of God's plan. Nicholas continued to preach about the glorious future awaiting them. Though his voice was getting hoarse and his congregation was getting noticeably smaller, the French contingent, meanwhile, had chosen the sensible route of heading directly south toward the Mediterranean. Stephen led his followers through the countryside of France, where the language was familiar and the terrain was manageable. This gave them a significant advantage over their German counterparts, though advantage in this context meant dying slightly more slowly. Stephen had promised that the sea would part at Marseille, allowing the children to walk to the Holy Land on dry seabed. This was an ambitious claim, considering that Moses had been dealing with a considerably smaller body of water and had possessed certain prophetic credentials that Stephen notably lacked. But the children believed, because belief was all they had left after walking several hundred miles on empty stomachs and sore feet. They reached Marseille in a state that could charitably be described as bedraggled. Thousands of children, dirty, hungry, exhausted, but still convinced that they were about to witness a miracle that would make their suffering worthwhile. They stood on the beach, raised their arms, and commanded the Mediterranean to part in the name of God, Christ, and the liberation of Jerusalem. The sea, displaying the same theological indifference as the Alps, remained stubbornly liquid. Waves continued to wave, tides continued to tide, and fish continued to swim without any apparent concern for the spiritual emergency occurring on the shoreline. The children waited. They prayed harder. They commanded more forcefully. The sea remained magnificently, devastatingly unchanged. This is where the story takes a turn from tragic to horrifying. Two merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, approached Stephen with an offer. They had ships, they said. They would transport the children to the Holy Land free of charge, out of the goodness of their hearts and their deep commitment to the crusading cause. They were moved by the children's plight and wanted to help complete their sacred mission. Stephen, faced with the awkward reality of an uncooperative ocean, accepted this offer with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that his grand plan had a fatal flaw. Here was divine providence in action, he declared. God was providing ships instead of parting the sea. It was a different miracle, but still a miracle nonetheless. The children boarded 7 vessels provided by these merchants, packed together like cargo, which, as it turned out, was exactly what they were. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were slave traders, and they had just acquired several thousand young Christians to sell in the markets of North Africa. The children had walked hundreds of miles to deliver themselves directly into bondage. 2 of the ships sank in a storm off the coast of Sardinia, taking their human cargo to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The other 5 ships reached their destination, where the children were sold to Muslim merchants who had absolutely no interest in conversion or liberation. Instead of freeing the Holy Land, the surviving children found themselves working in fields, houses and markets, their crusading dreams replaced by the daily reality of forced labor. Nicholas and his German followers, meanwhile, had somehow managed to cross the Alps, though their numbers had been reduced by roughly half. They straggled into northern Italy, looking like refugees from a particularly harsh winter, which is essentially what they were. Nicholas still maintained that God would provide ships, but his confidence was beginning to show cracks around the edges. The Italian response to 20,000 German children wandering around demanding free passage to Jerusalem was mixed. Some were sympathetic, offering food and shelter. Others were suspicious, wondering what kind of parents send their children on thousand-mile walks to foreign countries. A few were opportunistic, seeing potential profit in desperate circumstances. Pope Innocent II, when news of the children reached Rome, was reportedly less than enthusiastic about the entire enterprise. The Catholic Church had not sanctioned this crusade, had not requested child soldiers, and was not particularly interested in explaining to European parents why their offspring had vanished into the Mediterranean. The Pope supposedly told the children to go home and wait until they were old enough to crusade properly, with weapons and adult supervision. But going home meant admitting failure, and failure meant that all their suffering had been meaningless. Many of the children scattered across Italy instead, some begging in the streets, others trying to find work, a few attempting to reach the Holy Land by other means. Nicholas himself disappeared from historical records around this time, possibly having finally realized that divine intervention was not forthcoming, or possibly having been quietly removed by adults who were tired of explaining his prophecies. The aftermath of the Children's Crusade was a masterpiece of medieval damage control. The Catholic Church distanced itself from the enterprise, emphasizing that it had never endorsed sending children to reclaim Jerusalem. Parents who had lost their children looked for someone to blame and found plenty of candidates, from the boys who had started the movement to the merchants who had profited from it to the adults who had allowed it to happen. Stephen of Cloyes, the French shepherd boy who had started it all, also vanished from history. Whether he died, fled, or was quietly eliminated by people who held him responsible for the disaster, no one knows. The letter from Jesus was never produced, which was probably for the best, since it would have been difficult to explain why the Son of God had such poor handwriting. The whole episode was quietly forgotten by official histories, tucked away like an embarrassing family secret. The Catholic Church had more successful crusades to celebrate, and European nobility had more profitable wars to fight. The Children's Crusade became a footnote, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when religious enthusiasm meets poor planning and adult irresponsibility. But the real tragedy wasn't just the death and suffering of the children, though that was certainly tragic enough. The real tragedy was that it was entirely preventable. Every adult who watched those processions of children march past had the power to stop them, to send them home, to explain that divine intervention is not a reliable travel plan. Instead, they waved and prayed and hoped for miracles while children walked to their deaths. The medieval mindset that made the Children's Crusade possible was a unique blend of religious fervor, geographical ignorance, and a disturbing willingness to gamble with other people's lives. It was an age when maps showed sea monsters instead of accurate coastlines, when travel meant months of walking through hostile territory, when the difference between 100 miles and 1,000 miles was purely theoretical to most people. Children in 1212 lived in a world where miracles were expected, where saints regularly intervened in human affairs, where God was actively involved in the day-to-day management of Christian affairs. If an adult claimed divine revelation, it was taken seriously. If a child claimed the same thing, it was taken even more seriously, because children were supposedly closer to God, unburdened by the sins that corrupted adult hearts. This created a perfect storm of conditions for disaster. Charismatic child leaders, adults who believed in their divine mission, a political and religious climate that encouraged crusading, and a complete lack of practical knowledge about the realities of medieval travel and warfare. Add in a few unscrupulous merchants and the standard medieval indifference to child welfare, and you have all the ingredients for tragedy. The Children's Crusade was also a symptom of larger problems in medieval society. The Crusades had been going on for over a century by 1212, and they had not been notably successful. Jerusalem had been captured, lost, recaptured, and lost again. The Holy Land remained stubbornly unconverted. The Muslims remained undefeated. And the whole enterprise was beginning to look like an expensive way to get Europeans killed in foreign deserts. But admitting that the Crusades were a failure would have required questioning fundamental assumptions about divine favor, Christian superiority, and the righteousness of holy war. It was easier to believe that the problem wasn't with the Crusades themselves, but with the Crusaders. Adult warriors had failed because they were corrupted by sin, greed, and worldly concerns. Children, pure and innocent, would surely succeed where their elders had failed. This logic was appealing because it placed the blame for crusading failures on moral inadequacy rather than strategic impossibility. It suggested that the problem was spiritual, not practical, and could therefore be solved through greater faith rather than better planning. It also conveniently ignored the fact that warfare requires certain skills that children do not typically possess, such as the ability to swing a sword without falling over. The merchants who profited from the children's crusade were products of their time as well. Medieval commerce was a rough business, and slave trading was considered a legitimate profession in many parts of Europe. The opportunity to acquire several thousand young, healthy slaves at no cost would have seemed like excellent business sense to men who made their living buying and selling human beings. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were not cartoon villains twirling their mustaches while plotting against innocent children. They were businessmen who saw an opportunity and took it. The fact that their opportunity involved betraying trusting children and condemning them to lives of slavery was regrettable. But business was business. In a world where life was cheap and children were expendable, their actions were unethical but not unprecedented. The parents who allowed their children to join the crusade were also acting according to the values of their time. Medieval childhood was not the protected, sheltered experience we know today. Children worked, fought, married, and died alongside adults. Sending a child on a crusade was not qualitatively different from sending them to work in a monastery, serve in a noble household, or learn a trade in a distant city. All of these involved separation, risk, and uncertainty. Moreover, the promise of spiritual reward was genuinely compelling to medieval parents. If their child died on crusade, they would become a martyr, guaranteed entrance to heaven. If they succeeded, they would return covered in glory and divine favor. Either outcome was better than a life of peasant drudgery in some unnamed village. The crusade offered their children a chance at significance that would never come from tending sheep or plowing fields. The psychological impact on the survivors of the children's crusade is difficult to imagine. These were children who had walked hundreds of miles, sustained by absolute faith in their divine mission, only to discover that God was not particularly interested in their sacrifice. They had believed they were chosen, special, destined for greatness, and instead found themselves sold like livestock or abandoned in foreign countries. Some probably never recovered from this disillusionment. Others might have rationalized it as part of God's mysterious plan. A few possibly maintained their faith despite everything, believing that their suffering served some greater purpose that would be revealed in the afterlife. But all of them had to live with the knowledge that the adults they trusted had been wrong, that their faith had been misplaced, and that their childhood had ended in the most traumatic way possible. The long-term impact of the children's crusade on medieval society was minimal, which is perhaps the most damning indictment of all. Thousands of children died or disappeared, but European society continued exactly as before. No laws were passed to prevent similar disasters. No institutions were created to protect children from adult religious enthusiasm. No reforms were implemented to ensure that future crusades would be properly organized and supervised. The Crusades continued for another century after 1212, with equally disastrous results, but with adult participants. The Catholic Church continued to preach holy war against Muslims, Jews, and various Christian heretics. European nobility continued to send young men to die in foreign lands for the glory of God and the expansion of political power. The Children's Crusade changed nothing because it was seen as an aberration rather than a logical consequence of crusading ideology. Medieval chroniclers who recorded the Children's Crusade tended to focus on its supernatural aspects rather than its practical failures. They debated whether the visions were genuine, whether the children were truly chosen by God, whether the disasters that befell them were divine punishment for some hidden sin. They did not ask why adults had allowed children to attempt something that trained warriors found impossible. This focus on the miraculous rather than the practical reflected medieval priorities. The question was not whether sending children on crusade was sensible, but whether it was divinely inspired. If God had commanded it, then human considerations of safety, logistics, and probability were irrelevant. If God had not commanded it, then the children's suffering was their own fault for following false prophets. The legacy of the Children's Crusade in popular culture has been mixed. Some accounts romanticize it as a noble sacrifice, emphasizing the faith and courage of the children, while glossing over the exploitation and tragedy. Others use it as an example of medieval ignorance and superstition, a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. Very few focus on what it reveals about adult responsibility and the protection of children. The story has been retold countless times over the centuries, each version reflecting the values and concerns of its own era. Romantic poets emphasized the tragic nobility of doomed youth. Rationalist historians focused on the delusions and superstitions that made it possible. Modern writers often use it as an allegory for various contemporary issues, from child abuse to religious manipulation to the exploitation of idealism. But the historical Children's Crusade was neither romantic tragedy nor simple allegory. It was a concrete disaster that happened to real children, with real names and real families. They walked real miles, felt real hunger, suffered real deaths, and were sold into real slavery. Their tragedy was not symbolic or metaphorical, but immediate and personal. The fact that we know so little about most of these children individually makes their story even more poignant. They have become a collective noun, the Children's Crusade, rather than thousands of separate human beings with their own hopes, fears, and experiences. History has erased their individuality, just as thoroughly as medieval society erased their lives. Medieval record, keeping was spotty at best, and the records that do exist focus on leaders and events rather than ordinary participants. We know about Stephen and Nicholas because they were the organizers, but the thousands of children who followed them remain nameless. Occasionally a chronicle mentions a particular incident or individual, but these are exceptions that highlight how little we know about the rest. This anonymity was typical of medieval attitudes toward children, who were generally considered unimportant until they reached adulthood. Their deaths were regrettable, but not remarkable. Their suffering was unfortunate, but not unexpected. They were expendable in a way that adult lives, particularly noble adult lives, were not. The Children's Crusade would have been recorded very differently if it had involved adult nobles rather than peasant children. The geographical knowledge available in 1212 was also woefully inadequate for the kind of journey the children attempted. Medieval maps were works of art rather than navigation tools, filled with religious symbolism and mythological creatures. The distance from northern Europe to Jerusalem was theoretical to most people, who measured travel time in days or weeks rather than miles. The children probably had no real understanding of how far they were going or what the journey would entail. Jerusalem might as well have been on the moon, for all they knew about reaching it. The promise that God would shorten the distance or provide miraculous transportation was not obviously unrealistic to people who had never traveled more than a day's walk from home. Similarly, their understanding of warfare was based on stories and songs rather than experience. The Crusades in popular imagination were glorious adventures where Christian knights fought valiantly against infidel armies and won through divine favor. The reality of medieval warfare, which involved hunger, disease, political complexity, and massive casualties, was not part of these romantic narratives. The children expected to march into Jerusalem singing hymns, convert the Muslims through the power of their pure faith, and return home as heroes. They had no concept of military strategy, siege warfare, supply lines, or any of the practical considerations that made crusading so difficult and deadly. Their plan was based on fairy tales rather than military history. The economic realities of medieval life also contributed to the disaster. Most of the children came from poor families who could barely feed them under normal circumstances. The promise of divine provision would have been particularly appealing to people who worried about their next meal. A crusade that promised both spiritual reward and material support would have seemed like an answer to prayer. Parents who sent their children away may have been motivated as much by desperation as by faith. One less mouth to feed during a harsh winter could mean the difference between survival and starvation for the rest of the family. The crusade offered a way to provide for their child's future while reducing the burden on household resources. It was a cruel calculation, but medieval life required cruel calculations. The religious education of medieval children was also limited and often inaccurate. They learned Christianity through stories, songs, and visual imagery rather than through careful study of theological texts. Their understanding of God, Jesus, and divine intervention was necessarily simple and often magical. The idea that God would personally intervene to help them succeed would have seemed perfectly reasonable, given what they knew about Christian history. The social pressure to participate in the crusade was enormous once it began. Children who refused to join were seen as lacking faith, courage, or proper Christian commitment. Parents who tried to keep their children home were accused of interfering with God's plan. The movement developed its own momentum, carrying along many participants who might have preferred to stay home, but could not resist the social expectations. The role of the Catholic Church in the Children's Crusade was ambiguous, and probably deliberately so. Official church doctrine supported crusading in general, and many local priests encouraged the children, or at least failed to discourage them. But the church hierarchy maintained plausible deniability by never formally endorsing the enterprise. This allowed them to distance themselves from the disaster without having to repudiate their general support for holy war. The medieval communication system also contributed to the catastrophe. News traveled slowly and unreliably, often becoming distorted in the process. Parents who sent their children off with Stephen or Nicholas probably never learned what happened to them. The survivors who were sold into slavery had no way to send word home. Families were destroyed without even knowing that they had been destroyed. The legal status of children in medieval society provided no protection against this kind of exploitation. Children were considered property of their parents, who could dispose of them as they saw fit. There were no laws against endangering children, no institutions responsible for their welfare, no concept of children's rights as distinct from parental authority. Adults who profited from the Children's Crusade faced no legal consequences because they had broken no laws. The psychological manipulation involved in organizing the Children's Crusade was sophisticated even by modern standards. Stephen and Nicholas used techniques that would be familiar to any cult leader: claims of divine revelation, promises of special status, creation of in-group identity, isolation from family and normal social structures, and escalating commitment that made backing out increasingly difficult. The children were told they were chosen, special, more faithful than adults who had failed to liberate Jerusalem. They were given a sense of purpose and importance that their ordinary lives lacked. They were surrounded by other believers who reinforced their commitment and made doubt seem like betrayal. By the time they realized the magnitude of their mistake, they were hundreds of miles from home with no way to return. The adults who enabled the children's crusade were not necessarily evil, but they were certainly irresponsible. They allowed their own religious enthusiasms and political ambitions to override their duty to protect children. They treated child welfare as less important than theological correctness. They valued faith more than safety, and spiritual purity more than practical wisdom. This prioritization of abstract religious goals over concrete human welfare was typical of medieval Christianity, which often seemed more concerned with souls than with bodies. The fact that children suffered and died was regrettable, but their spiritual destiny was more important than their physical survival. If they died as martyrs, their deaths actually improved their eternal prospects. The merchants who profited from the children's crusade were enabled by a society that considered slavery normal and children expendable. Their actions were unethical even by medieval standards, but the ethical standards were low enough that they faced no serious consequences. They were probably never prosecuted, never punished, and never held accountable for their betrayal of trusting children. The geographic and cultural barriers that the children faced were insurmountable, even under the best circumstances. They spoke different languages, came from different countries, and had no understanding of the territories they were crossing. They were foreigners everywhere they went, dependent on the charity of strangers who often viewed them with suspicion or hostility. The political situation in 1212 was also unfavorable for any kind of crusading activity. The various Crusader states in the Holy Land were weak, divided, and under constant pressure from Muslim armies. Even a well-organized adult crusade would have faced enormous challenges. A disorganized mob of European children had no chance whatsoever of military success. The technological limitations of medieval transportation made the journey itself a deadly undertaking. There were no roads as we understand them, no reliable maps, no established supply chains, no emergency services. Travel was slow, dangerous, and expensive. The children were attempting something that defeated many experienced adult travelers. The medical knowledge available in 1212 was also inadequate for dealing with the health problems that arose during the journey. Medieval medicine was based on superstition and tradition rather than scientific understanding. Diseases that are easily treatable today were often fatal in the 13th century. The children had no protection against plague, dysentery, exposure, or malnutrition. The Children's Crusade was ultimately a perfect storm of medieval limitations, geographic ignorance, technological inadequacy, religious extremism, adult irresponsibility, economic desperation, political instability, medical ignorance, legal indifference, and social pressure. Any one of these factors might have been manageable, but together they created conditions for inevitable disaster. The most tragic aspect of the Children's Crusade was not that it failed, but that failure was inevitable from the beginning. Every adult who watched those processions of children should have known that they were marching to their deaths. The signs were obvious, the problems were predictable, and the solutions were available. But religious enthusiasm, political calculation, and plain indifference allowed the tragedy to unfold exactly as it had to unfold. In the end, the Children's Crusade stands as a monument to the consequences of placing abstract ideals above concrete human welfare. It demonstrates what happens when adults abandon their responsibility to protect children in favor of pursuing religious or political goals. It shows how quickly noble intentions can become exploitation when combined with power imbalances and cultural blind spots. The children who died in the Alps, drowned in the Mediterranean, or disappeared into North African slave markets were not just victims of medieval ignorance. They were casualties of adult choices, sacrifices to adult priorities, evidence of adult failures. Their tragedy was not inevitable in some cosmic sense, but was the predictable result of decisions made by people who should have known better. The lesson of the Children's Crusade is not that medieval people were uniquely cruel or stupid, but that any society can convince itself to sacrifice its most vulnerable members for the sake of its most cherished beliefs. The specific circumstances were medieval, but the underlying dynamics are universal. Adults always have reasons for endangering children, and those reasons always seem compelling at the time. The children of 1212 walked into history and vanished, leaving behind only fragmentary records and cautionary tales. They deserved better from the adults who were supposed to protect them, better from the society that claimed to value them, and better from the church that promised to guide them. Instead, they got a disaster that was entirely preventable and absolutely tragic, a reminder of what happens when faith replaces wisdom and enthusiasm substitutes for responsibility. The immediate aftermath of the Children's Crusade was a masterclass in medieval damage control and collective amnesia. News of the disaster filtered back to Europe slowly, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and the occasional survivor who managed to escape their captors or make their way home through sheer determination and extraordinary luck. But even when the truth became known, the response was muted, confused, and ultimately ineffective. The Catholic Church, faced with the public relations nightmare of having implicitly endorsed a venture that resulted in the death or enslavement of thousands of children, adopted a strategy of strategic forgetfulness. Official church records from the period are remarkably silent about the Children's Crusade, mentioning it only in passing or not at all. When it was discussed, it was typically framed as a popular delusion that the church had always opposed, despite evidence to the contrary. Local priests, who had blessed the departing children, suddenly developed selective memory about their involvement. Bishops who had praised the enterprise when it seemed divinely inspired now claimed they had always harbored doubts. The Pope himself, when pressed on the matter, allegedly expressed regret that such a thing had been allowed to happen, while carefully avoiding any discussion of why it had been allowed to happen in the first place. This institutional amnesia served several purposes beyond simple embarrassment avoidance. The Catholic Church in 1212 was engaged in multiple crusades across Europe and the Mediterranean, and admitting that one particular crusade had been a catastrophic mistake would have raised uncomfortable questions about the others. If sending pure-hearted children to liberate Jerusalem was a tragic error, what did that say about sending corrupted adults to do the same thing? Moreover, the Church's entire theological framework for crusading was built on the premise that God favored Christian military action against infidels. The failure of the Children's Crusade suggested either that God did not actually favor such actions, or that the children had been somehow unworthy of divine support. Neither explanation was acceptable to an institution whose authority rested on its claimed ability to interpret divine will. The secular authorities who had witnessed the children's departure were equally eager to distance themselves from the disaster. Nobles who had provided safe passage through their territories now claimed they had been deceived by the children's leaders. Town officials who had allowed the processions to pass through their jurisdictions insisted they had tried to discourage the enterprise. Even parents who had actively encouraged their children to join the crusade began to claim they had been victims of religious manipulation. This collective rewriting of history was made easier by the medieval approach to record keeping, which was sporadic at best and heavily influenced by political considerations. Chronicles of the period were typically written by monks or clerics who had their own reasons for emphasizing certain events while minimizing others. The Children's Crusade was exactly the kind of embarrassing incident that chroniclers preferred to forget or reinterpret. The few records that do exist paint a picture of confusion and conflicting accounts. Some chroniclers claimed the children had been led astray by the devil. Others suggested they had been punished by God for their presumption. A few maintained that the crusade had been divinely inspired, but poorly executed. Virtually none admitted that adults had failed in their fundamental responsibility to protect children from their own misguided enthusiasm. The parents who had lost children in the crusade faced a different kind of tragedy. Many never learned what had happened to their sons and daughters. They waited for years, hoping for letters that never came, for return visits that never occurred. Some convinced themselves that their children were living happily in the Holy Land, successfully converting Muslims and establishing Christian communities. Others gradually accepted that their children were dead, but found comfort in believing they had died as martyrs. A few parents attempted to investigate their children's fate, traveling to the Mediterranean ports where the children had last been seen, making inquiries among merchants and ship captains. These investigations rarely yielded satisfactory answers. The slave traders who had profited from the children's trust were not inclined to provide detailed accounting of their transactions, and the buyers in North African markets had no reason to maintain records of individual purchases. The psychological impact on the families left behind rippled through communities for generations. Younger siblings grew up hearing whispered stories about brothers and sisters who had vanished into legend. Parents who had encouraged one child to join the Crusade became overprotective of their remaining children, sometimes to the point of paranoia. Communities that had enthusiastically supported the enterprise developed a collective guilt that manifested in various ways, from increased charitable giving to suspicion of charismatic religious figures. The economic impact was also significant, though it has been largely overlooked by historians, focused on the religious and political dimensions of the story. Thousands of families lost children who represented both current labor and future economic security. In a society where children were essential for agricultural work and old age support, this loss had immediate and long-term consequences. Villages that had lost large numbers of children to the Crusade faced labor shortages at critical times in the agricultural cycle. Families that had expected their children to inherit land and carry on trades found themselves without successors. The demographic impact was particularly severe in areas where recruitment had been most successful, creating pockets of economic disruption that lasted for decades. The merchants who had profited from the children's tragedy, meanwhile, faced few consequences for their actions. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig disappeared from historical records shortly after the Crusade, probably having taken their profits and relocated to avoid uncomfortable questions. Slave trading was legal and profitable in the Mediterranean world of the 13th century, and their actions, while morally reprehensible, violated no laws and challenged no established customs. This impunity was typical of medieval justice, which was heavily weighted toward protecting the interests of those with money and power. The children who had been sold into slavery had no legal standing to pursue compensation, no families wealthy enough to seek justice on their behalf, and no institutions willing to advocate for their rights. They simply vanished into the anonymous mass of human property that fueled Mediterranean commerce. The few children who managed to escape their captors and return to Europe faced their own set of challenges. They came back changed by experiences that their families and communities could barely comprehend. Many had been forced to convert to Islam, at least nominally, which created complicated religious and social problems. Others had learned Arabic or Turkish, acquired skills in crafts or trades unknown in their home villages, or developed perspectives on the world that set them apart from their peers. These survivors often found themselves caught between worlds, no longer fully European, but never truly accepted in the societies where they had been enslaved. Their stories, when they were willing to tell them, provided the most detailed accounts of what had actually happened to the children. But these accounts were often dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. Medieval society had little framework for understanding or treating what we would now recognize as trauma. The political ramifications of the Children's Crusade extended beyond simple embarrassment for the institutions that had enabled it. The disaster occurred at a time when support for crusading was already beginning to wane among European nobility, who were finding the ventures increasingly expensive and unrewarding. The spectacle of thousands of children dying in pursuit of goals that adult warriors could not achieve provided ammunition for critics of the entire crusading enterprise. Some contemporary observers used the Children's Crusade as evidence that God had withdrawn his favor from Christian military adventures in the Holy Land. If divine support was not forthcoming for the purest and most faithful of crusaders, they argued, then perhaps the problem lay with the concept of holy war itself, rather than with the moral failings of individual participants. This line of reasoning was dangerous to both church and secular authorities, who had invested enormous resources and prestige in crusading ideology. The response was to frame the Children's Crusade as an aberration rather than a logical extension of crusading principles, a tragic mistake that proved nothing about the validity of properly organized holy wars conducted by appropriately qualified adults. The intellectual climate of the early 13th century was also shifting in ways that made the Children's Crusade seem increasingly anachronistic. The rise of scholasticism, with its emphasis on rational inquiry and systematic theology, created space for more critical examination of popular religious movements. The kind of unquestioning acceptance of miraculous claims that had made the Children's Crusade possible was becoming less common among educated elites. Universities were beginning to emerge as centers of learning that valued logical analysis over emotional enthusiasm. The new orders of mendicant friars, particularly the Dominicans and Franciscans, emphasized rigorous theological education and careful spiritual direction. These developments created institutional frameworks for evaluating religious claims more skeptically than had been common in previous centuries. However, these intellectual changes affected only a tiny fraction of European society. The vast majority of people remained illiterate, superstitious, and vulnerable to the same kinds of religious manipulation that had made the Children's Crusade possible. The structural conditions that had enabled the disaster remained largely unchanged, creating the potential for similar tragedies in the future. The long-term cultural impact of the Children's Crusade was complex and contradictory. On one hand, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious enthusiasm unchecked by practical wisdom. On the other hand, it was romanticized as an example of pure faith and noble sacrifice. These competing interpretations reflected broader tensions in medieval and later European culture about the relationship between spirituality and worldliness, between faith and reason, between idealism and pragmatism. Literary treatments of the Children's Crusade began appearing within decades of the events themselves, though these early accounts were heavily fictionalized and moralized. The story was used to illustrate various theological points about the relationship between divine will and human action, the nature of martyrdom, and the proper role of children in religious life. These literary versions often bore little resemblance to the historical facts, but they were more influential than accurate chronicles in shaping popular memory of the events. The emergence of the Children's Crusade as a literary theme also reflected changing attitudes toward childhood itself. The medieval period saw the gradual development of the concept of childhood as a distinct life stage with its own characteristics and needs. The tragedy of the Children's Crusade contributed to growing awareness that children required special protection and could not simply be treated as miniature adults. This evolving understanding of childhood had practical implications for how society dealt with religious enthusiasm among young people. While the institutional changes were slow and limited, there was a gradual shift toward greater skepticism of child prophets and visionaries. Adult authorities became somewhat more willing to question miraculous claims made by children and to consider the possibility that youthful religious enthusiasm might need to be guided and constrained rather than simply celebrated. The artistic legacy of the Children's Crusade was similarly complex. Medieval and Renaissance artists used the story as subject matter for paintings, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts, but these works typically emphasized the spiritual, rather than the practical dimensions of the events. Children were depicted as angelic figures, marching toward glory, rather than as vulnerable victims of adult negligence and exploitation. These artistic representations reinforced romanticized versions of the story, while obscuring its more disturbing implications. They contributed to a cultural narrative that emphasized the nobility of the children's intentions, while minimizing the culpability of the adults, who had failed to protect them. This selective memory served various ideological purposes, but did little to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. The medical understanding of what had happened to the children was limited by the scientific knowledge available in the medieval period. The deaths from exposure, malnutrition, and disease were attributed to various causes, from divine punishment to demonic influence to natural weakness. There was little recognition that many of these deaths could have been prevented through proper preparation, adequate supplies, and competent leadership. Similarly, the psychological impact on survivors was not well understood or systematically addressed. Medieval society had limited concepts of mental health and trauma, and the children who returned from captivity were expected to simply resume their normal lives without recognition of what they had endured. Some probably never recovered from their experiences, while others found ways to integrate their trauma into their ongoing lives without institutional support or understanding. The technological limitations that had contributed to the disaster also remained largely unchanged for several centuries after 1212. Transportation, communication, and navigation improved only gradually, and medieval Europe remained a place where long-distance travel was dangerous and uncertain. The specific conditions that had made the Children's Crusade so deadly continued to threaten all travelers, not just misguided children. The legal framework governing child welfare also evolved slowly, if at all. Children continued to be regarded as property of their parents, with few independent rights or protections. The concept of the state having an interest in child welfare that might override parental authority was still centuries in the future. The legal system that had been unable to prevent the Children's Crusade remained equally unable to prevent similar abuses. The economic systems that had motivated some participation in the Crusade also persisted. Poverty continued to drive families to desperate measures, and the promise of miraculous provision continued to appeal to people who struggled to feed their children. The underlying material conditions that had made the Crusade seem attractive to some families remained unchanged, creating ongoing vulnerability to similar schemes. The religious authority structures that had enabled the Children's Crusade also retained much of their power and influence. The Catholic Church continued to preach crusading ideology, to claim exclusive access to divine will, and to encourage popular religious movements that sometimes led to dangerous outcomes. While individual church leaders might have learned lessons from the disaster, the institutional framework that had made it possible remained largely intact. The educational systems that might have provided alternative frameworks for understanding the world were extremely limited in 1212 and remained so for generations afterward. The vast majority of Europeans remained illiterate and dependent on oral tradition and religious instruction for their understanding of geography, history, and theology. The ignorance that had made the Children's Crusade possible was not addressed through systematic educational reform. The social hierarchies that had placed children at the mercy of adult authority figures also persisted largely unchanged. Children continued to have little voice in decisions affecting their lives, little protection against adult exploitation, and little recourse when adults failed in their responsibilities. The power imbalances that had enabled the Children's Crusade remained embedded in the basic structure of medieval society. Perhaps most tragically, the specific lessons that should have been learned from the Children's Crusade were largely ignored or forgotten. Future religious movements continued to attract child participants. Future crusades continued to be launched with inadequate preparation, and unrealistic expectations, and future generations of adults continued to prioritize abstract ideals over concrete child welfare. The Children's Crusade thus stands not only as a historical tragedy, but as a symbol of systemic failures that extended far beyond the specific events of 2012. It represents the consequences of adult irresponsibility, institutional inadequacy, and social indifference to child welfare. Most importantly, it demonstrates how easily societies can convince themselves that their highest ideals justify their most destructive actions, especially when the costs are borne by those least able to resist or escape. The individual stories of the children who participated in the Crusade, while largely lost to history, can be reconstructed through the fragmentary evidence that survives and our understanding of medieval life. Consider Marcus, a fictional but representative 12-year-old from a village near Cologne, whose father was a blacksmith and whose mother had died in childbirth 3 years earlier. Marcus would have grown up in a world where the Crusades were not distant historical events, but ongoing realities that shaped everyday conversation and community identity. His father, Heinrich, would have been old enough to remember the Third Crusade and the stories of Emperor Barbarossa's death by drowning, Richard the Lionheart's exploits, and Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem. These stories would have been told and retold in the blacksmith shop, embellished with each telling until they achieved the status of legend. For Marcus, the Holy Land was not a distant geographical location, but a mystical realm where Christian heroes battled evil infidels in service of God. When Nicholas arrived in Marcus's village, preaching about the Children's Crusade that would succeed where adult warriors had failed, the boy would have been primed to believe. Here was a chance for adventure, for glory, for significance in a life that otherwise promised nothing more than inheriting his father's forge and spending his days shoeing horses and mending plowshares. The Crusade offered Marcus an opportunity to become part of the grand narrative of Christian history, rather than remaining a footnote in village life. Heinrich the blacksmith faced an agonizing decision. On one hand, his son represented his future security, the heir who would carry on his trade and care for him in old age. On the other hand, refusing to allow Marcus to join the Crusade would mark both father and son as lacking in faith and Christian commitment. The social pressure in small medieval communities was enormous, and families who tried to resist popular religious movements often found themselves ostracized and economically vulnerable. Moreover, Heinrich genuinely believed in the crusading ideal. He had contributed money to previous crusades, had blessed local young men who had taken crusading vows, and had mourned those who had died in service to Christ. The idea that children might succeed where adults had failed was not obviously absurd to a man whose entire worldview was built on the premise that God actively intervened in human affairs to reward faith and punish sin. The morning Marcus left, Heinrich gave him his best knife, a small leather bag with a few silver coins, and a blessing that masked his terror. The boy walked out of the village with a group of other children, singing hymns and carrying improvised banners. While their parents watched from doorways and tried to convince themselves they were doing the right thing. Most of these parents would never see their children again. Marcus's journey would have followed the predictable pattern of enthusiasm, gradually giving way to hardship and despair. The first few days were probably exciting, a grand adventure with friends from his village and new companions from other communities. The children would have shared stories, sung songs, and reinforced each other's conviction that they were engaged in holy work that would surely be rewarded with divine assistance. But walking 20 miles a day on medieval roads with inadequate food and no proper shelter takes a brutal toll on young bodies. Marcus would have developed blisters within the first week, blisters that burst and became infected because medieval medical knowledge included no understanding of antiseptic treatment. His shoes, probably hand-me-downs from an older relative, would have fallen apart under the constant strain, leaving him to walk on bloody, swollen feet that made each step agony. The food situation would have become desperate within days of leaving home. The children had expected to be fed by charitable villagers along their route, and some were, but most medieval communities barely produced enough food to feed their own populations. A few loaves of bread given to passing children might mean hunger for the donor's own family, and charity has always been limited by practical considerations as much as by religious duty. Marcus would have learned to forage for berries, nuts, and roots, but medieval forests were not supermarkets, and edible wild foods were often scarce or seasonal. Some children tried to catch fish in streams, but few had the necessary skills or equipment. Others attempted to trap small animals, but hunger makes poor hunters, and their efforts were usually unsuccessful. Starvation became a constant companion, the gnawing emptiness that made every step more difficult and every decision cloudier. The nights were particularly brutal. Medieval Europe in early autumn could be cold and wet, and the children had no tents, no bedrolls, no protection against the elements beyond their clothing, and whatever shelter, they could improvise from branches and leaves. They huddled together for warmth, but hypothermia claimed victims regularly. Children who simply never woke up from sleep, that offered their only escape from hunger and pain. Disease spread through the group like wildfire. Dysentery from contaminated water or spoiled food left children dehydrated and weak. Respiratory infections flourished in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Skin diseases, parasites, and infections from untreated wounds created additional suffering. Medieval medicine had no treatments for most of these conditions, and even if treatments had existed, they would not have been available to a mob of peasant children walking through foreign territories. Marcus probably died somewhere in the Alps, another anonymous casualty of adult irresponsibility and religious delusion. Perhaps he froze to death during a mountain storm, or succumbed to dysentery beside a mountain stream, or simply collapsed from exhaustion and starvation, and was left behind by companions who could not carry him. His body would have been buried in an unmarked grave, if it was buried at all, and his father Heinrich would have spent the rest of his life wondering what had become of his son. The story of Marguerite, a hypothetical participant in Stephen's French Crusade, would have followed similar patterns with variations specific to her circumstances. At 13, she was the daughter of a prosperous merchant in a town near Orleans, educated enough to read simple texts, and sophisticated enough to understand something about the world beyond her immediate community. Her participation in the Crusade represented a different kind of tragedy than Marcus's story, the destruction of privilege rather than the exploitation of desperation. Margaret's father, Guillaume, was initially opposed to his daughter's participation in Stephen's Crusade. As a merchant who had travelled extensively in France and neighbouring regions, he had a better understanding than most people of the distances involved and the dangers of long distance travel. He knew that Jerusalem was thousands of miles away, that the Mediterranean was a real ocean rather than a symbolic barrier, and that children had no business attempting journeys that challenged experienced adults. But Marguerite was determined to join the crusade, and her determination was supported by her mother, her younger siblings, and most of the family's social circle. The merchant's wife, Isabel, had been raised on stories of female saints and martyrs, and she saw her daughter's religious enthusiasm as evidence of special divine favour. Refusing to allow Marguerite to follow her calling would have seemed like interfering with God's plan for the girl's life. The social pressure in merchant families was different from, but no less intense than the pressure on peasant families. Guillaume's business depended on his reputation for reliability and Christian virtue. Customers who saw him as lacking in faith might take their trade elsewhere, and his standing in the merchant guild could be compromised if he appeared to oppose popular religious movements. Economic considerations reinforced religious and social pressures to support his daughter's decision. Marguerite left home with better equipment than most of the children in Stephen's group. She had good shoes, warm clothing, a substantial supply of food, and a purse with enough money to last several weeks. Her family's farewell was elaborate and public, a demonstration of their support for the crusading cause and their confidence in divine protection for their daughter. Guillaume blessed Margaret publicly, while privately praying that she would change her mind and return home before reaching the Mediterranean. For the first part of her journey, Margaret's superior resources allowed her to avoid the worst hardships that afflicted poorer children. She could buy food when foraging failed, seek shelter in inns when weather made camping impossible, and replace worn-out equipment when necessary. Her literacy made her valuable to Stephen's organization as someone who could help with record keeping and communication, giving her a status within the group that provided additional protection. But even privilege could not protect against the fundamental impossibility of the enterprise. Margaret's money ran out, her clothes wore through, her shoes fell apart. The advantages she had started with were temporary, and once they were gone, she faced the same hunger, exposure, and disease that killed poorer children. Her education, which had seemed so valuable at the beginning of the journey, became irrelevant when the basic requirements were physical endurance and the ability to survive on nothing. When Stephen's group reached Marseille and the sea failed to part, Margaret was among the children who boarded the ships provided by Hugh the Iron and William the Pig. Her literacy made her particularly valuable in the slave markets of North Africa, where educated European women could command premium prices as tutors, translators, or administrators in wealthy households. She was sold to a merchant family in Alexandria, where she spent the rest of her life as a domestic slave, never again seeing France or her family. Marguerite's fate was probably better than that of most children who survived the sea voyage. Her education and social background made her useful rather than merely expendable, and she may have lived relatively comfortably within the constraints of her bondage. But she never returned home, never married and had children of her own, never fulfilled the life her parents had imagined for her. The crusade that was supposed to elevate her to sainthood instead reduced her to property. The children who participated in the Children's Crusade came from every level of medieval society and brought their class backgrounds with them into the disaster. Noble children had better equipment and more resources, but they also had less experience with physical hardship and were often less prepared for the brutal realities of the journey. Peasant children were accustomed to hunger and discomfort, but they had fewer resources to draw upon when conditions became desperate. Some children were genuine believers who had been moved by religious enthusiasm, while others were motivated more by the promise of adventure or escape from difficult family situations. A few were probably running away from home and saw the crusade as convenient cover for their flight. Others may have been encouraged or forced to participate by parents who saw the crusade as a solution to economic problems or family conflicts. The group dynamics that developed during the journey were complex and often destructive. Leadership positions emerged among the children, but these leaders had no real qualifications for the responsibilities they assumed. Older children dominated younger ones, stronger children exploited weaker ones, and children from prosperous families were targeted by those from poorer backgrounds. The solidarity that had characterized the early days of the crusade broke down under the pressure of hunger, exhaustion, and despair. Religious observance, which had been central to the children's identity at the beginning of the journey, gradually gave way to more basic concerns about survival. Daily prayers became less frequent as energy was conserved for walking. Songs and hymns were replaced by silence as voices became too weak to sing. The crosses and banners that had marked the children as crusaders were abandoned along the roadside, as even their symbolic weight became too much to bear. The psychological transformation of the children during the course of the crusade was profound and tragic. They had started the journey as confident young people, certain of their divine mission and their ultimate success. They ended it, if they survived at all, as traumatized victims who had learned through bitter experience that faith alone was not sufficient to overcome physical reality. For the children who were eventually sold into slavery, the adjustment to their new lives must have been extraordinarily difficult. They had been raised as Christians in European communities where their cultural identity was taken for granted. Suddenly, they found themselves in alien environments where everything from language to religion to social customs was different. Some probably never adapted and died from despair or illness. Others may have found ways to preserve elements of their original identity while accepting the reality of their new circumstances. The children who managed to escape from slavery or otherwise make their way back to Europe faced different, but equally challenging problems. They returned to communities that had moved on from the Crusade, families that had mourned them and begun new lives, and societies that were often unwilling to acknowledge what had happened to them. Their stories were reminders of a disaster that most people preferred to forget. These returning children often found that their places in their original communities had been filled by others. Younger siblings had assumed inheritance rights, family businesses had been transferred to other relatives, and social positions had been taken by people who had stayed home. The children who had left expecting to return as heroes found themselves displaced persons in their own homeland. The long-term psychological effects on survivors are impossible to document with medieval sources, but they must have been severe. These children had experienced trauma, captivity, violence, and cultural displacement at ages when their personalities and worldviews were still forming. Many probably never fully recovered from these experiences, carrying the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. The impact on medieval European society was more subtle, but no less real. Communities that had lost large numbers of children faced immediate practical problems and long-term demographic consequences. The economic disruption was significant in some areas, particularly where recruitment had been most successful. The social trauma of losing so many young people created lasting changes in how communities approached religious enthusiasm and child welfare. The political consequences of the Children's Crusade extended beyond the immediate embarrassment to church and secular authorities. The disaster occurred during a period when the entire crusading enterprise was under increasing strain, both financially and ideologically. The spectacle of thousands of children dying in pursuit of goals that adult armies could not achieve provided ammunition for critics who had always questioned the wisdom of holy war. Some contemporary observers saw the Children's Crusade as divine judgment against the corruption and worldliness of adult crusaders. If God had withdrawn his favor from professional warriors, they argued, it was because these warriors were motivated more by greed and political ambition than by genuine religious commitment. The children's failure thus became evidence not of the futility of crusading, but of the need for more spiritually pure crusaders. Others drew the opposite conclusion, arguing that the disaster proved that crusading itself was misconceived. If even the purest and most faithful participants could not succeed, then perhaps God did not actually favor Christian military action in the Holy Land. This interpretation was more dangerous to established authorities, as it questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying centuries of church policy and papal authority. The intellectual response to the Children's Crusade was complicated by the limited communication systems of the medieval period. News traveled slowly and was often distorted in transmission, making it difficult for contemporary observers to understand what had actually happened. Many accounts were second or third-hand, filtered through the perspectives and prejudices of chroniclers who had not witnessed the events themselves. The chroniclers who did record the Children's Crusade were typically monks or clerics with their own theological and political agendas. They were more interested in the moral and spiritual lessons that could be drawn from the story than in documenting the practical details of what had occurred. Their accounts emphasized supernatural elements while minimizing human failures, creating a historical record that obscured more than it revealed. The artistic and literary treatments of the Children's Crusade that began appearing in subsequent centuries were even further removed from historical reality. These works used the basic framework of the story to explore various themes related to innocence, faith, sacrifice, and divine justice. But they bore little resemblance to the actual experiences of the children who had participated in the historical events. The romanticization of the Children's Crusade in later literature served various ideological purposes, but did little to honor the memory of the actual victims. By transforming a story of adult negligence and child exploitation into a tale of noble sacrifice and spiritual triumph, these works perpetuated the same kinds of thinking that had made the original disaster possible. The legal framework that had failed to protect the children in 1212 remained largely unchanged for centuries afterward. Medieval law recognized few rights for children independent of their parents, and parental authority was nearly absolute. The concept that society might have an interest in child welfare that could override parental decisions was still far in the future. Similarly, the economic conditions that had motivated some participation in the Crusade persisted throughout the medieval period and beyond. Poverty continued to drive families to desperate measures, and the promise of miraculous provision continued to appeal to people struggling with basic survival. The underlying material conditions remained unchanged, creating ongoing vulnerability to similar schemes. The religious authority structures that had enabled the Children's Crusade also retained much of their power and legitimacy. The Catholic Church continued to preach crusading ideology, though with somewhat less enthusiasm, after the disasters of the 13th century. Popular religious movements continued to attract followers, including children, and ecclesiastical authorities continued to struggle with the problem of distinguishing genuine divine inspiration from dangerous delusion. The educational systems that might have provided alternative frameworks for understanding the world remained extremely limited. Literacy rates were low, schools were rare, and most people's knowledge of geography, history, and theology came from oral sources that were often unreliable. The ignorance that had made the Children's Crusade possible was not addressed through systematic educational reform until much later periods. The technological limitations that had contributed to the disaster also improved only gradually. Transportation remained dangerous and uncertain. Communication systems remained slow and unreliable, and medical knowledge advanced slowly. The specific conditions that had made the Children's Crusade so deadly continued to threaten travelers throughout the medieval period. Perhaps most significantly, the social attitudes that had made the Children's Crusade possible showed remarkable persistence. Adults continued to prioritize abstract ideals over concrete child welfare. Religious authorities continued to claim exclusive access to divine will, and societies continued to convince themselves that their highest principles justified their most destructive actions. The memory of the Children's Crusade became a kind of cultural scar tissue, acknowledged but not fully examined, remembered but not properly understood. It served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious enthusiasm, while simultaneously being romanticized as an example of pure faith and noble intentions. This contradictory legacy reflected broader tensions in European culture about the relationship between spirituality and practical wisdom. The story of the Children's Crusade ultimately transcends its specific historical context to become a parable about power, responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable populations. It demonstrates how easily societies can sacrifice their most defenseless members in pursuit of abstract goals, and how readily adults can abandon their fundamental duties when those duties conflict with their ideological commitments. The children who died in the Alps, drowned in the Mediterranean, or vanished into North African slave markets, were not just victims of medieval ignorance or religious fanaticism. They were casualties of systems and structures that prioritized adult interests over child welfare, institutional authority over individual protection, and ideological purity over practical wisdom. Their tragedy was the predictable result of choices made by people who should have known better and could have done better. The lasting significance of the Children's Crusade lies not in its exotic medieval setting or its religious context, but in its demonstration of universal human tendencies that transcend historical periods and cultural boundaries. The capacity for adults to endanger children in service of abstract ideals, the willingness of institutions to sacrifice individuals for organizational goals, and the tendency of societies to rationalize their failures while perpetuating the conditions that created them, all remain relevant concerns in any era. The children of 1212 deserve to be remembered not as symbols or metaphors, but as real human beings whose lives were cut short by preventable tragedy. They were someone's sons and daughters, with names and personalities and dreams that were never fulfilled. Their story is ultimately a call for vigilance against the human capacity for self-deception, and a reminder that the most vulnerable members of society deserve protection, especially when that protection conflicts with popular enthusiasm and institutional authority.